So you'll want to get straight to the show. So you'll want to know what you need to know. You want to know what we're all here for. Well, you better get hip to Podcast by George. Podcast by George. Podcast by George. He knows what he's fighting for. It's Podcast by George. Podcast by George. Want to know what we're fighting for?
Hello, hi, how are you? Welcome back to Podcast by George Special Day. She's back. Laura Belin with Bleeding Heartland is back on Podcast by George, one of America's top muckraking investigative journalists, and certainly here in the state of Iowa. And I'm just delighted to have her back on Podcast by George. Just a little brief intro now for people that aren't aware. Bleeding Heartland is a community blog providing original reporting, emphasis on original reporting. She's just not regurgitating stuff on this blog. A lot of this is original, and it's exclusive to Laura and her contributors. So check out Bleeding Heartland. And it's about politics, especially campaigns and elections, state government, social and environmental issues. Bleeding Heartland also covers what the Iowans in Congress are up to and any federal, state, or local policies of interest to Iowa readers. So let's welcome Laura Belin back to a Podcast by George. Hi, Laura.
No, thanks. It's always great to be here, George.
Well, I want to bring up the newsletter here to kind of get us started because, that's a good jumping off point. This is where the good stuff is. So let me bring that up on screen. Okay, so here's the top of the page, Bleeding Heartland, and here's the most recent post. Now, the thing I want to encourage people to do, of course, is to support Bleeding Heartland. And, before we get started here, I want to mention you can do that on Patreon, maybe the easiest place to do it, but there's several ways to do it. Venmo and other, just throw them, $5-10 a month if you like this kind of reporting. You're not going to get it anywhere else. You're not going to find it anywhere else. And she's working her tail off to get these stories. So that's my plug for Bleeding Heartland. So, Laura, the first posting here is by a contributor on combating voter suppression. Then we go to the voucher bill in the legislature and the problems with that, and then redistricting. So I don't know. This voter suppression thing is huge across the country, of course. My wife is really concerned about this. I follow that issue a lot through another investigative journalist that I know you're well aware of, Greg Palast. He's been reporting on voters being purged around the country in huge numbers over the past decades. Georgia, Wisconsin, North Carolina, and in Michigan also just purged from the rolls. But Iowa's got its own kind of unique situation here. Can you explain what we're facing?
Yes. Well, it seems like after every election now, Republicans try to make it harder and harder to vote. So in 2017, they cut our early voting window from 40 days to 29. They introduced voter ID requirements and some other restrictions. Then in 2019 and 2020, they passed some things that would make it harder for county auditors to send absentee ballot request forms to people. And now this year, they have passed a really wide-ranging bill where no matter how you try to vote, if you like to vote by mail, if you like to vote early in person, if you vote on election day, no matter how you like to vote, you're going to have less time and it's going to be harder for you to accomplish that under this new bill. So I covered that extensively, and there actually a lawsuit was filed the morning after Governor Reynolds signed that bill. So it's going to be considered in the Iowa courts, but you got to remember the Iowa Supreme Court is predominantly Republican appointed judges. And so I'm not too optimistic that they're going to strike down this law. So this post that's up on my front page right now by Bryce Smith, he chairs the Dallas County Democrats, and he has some ideas about, what can just ordinary activists do to try to combat this bill, because it's very concerning that some people who might want to vote in 2022 or 2024 might find it difficult to do that within the time frame.
Well, and I can only give you my take on it. I sometimes think the podcast should be entitled "What in the Hell?" because you got the Republicans running around screaming about election integrity and voter integrity and all of this, and I'm like, well, okay, yeah, there's a problem. I mentioned Greg Palast down there in Georgia. He found 200,000 voters that were purged from the rolls down there. Virtually all of them were Democrat. and virtually all of them were minorities. I mean, there is a problem, but the integrity issue has never been found to be a problem here in Iowa or virtually any place else, at least in the Republican context. Am I right?
Yeah, well, they're not even really claiming during the Iowa House and Senate debate, they weren't even claiming that there was major fraud associated with early voting in 2020. They just said kind of vaguely that it would improve integrity. And they also said somehow that it would shorten political campaigns to shorten the time people have to vote, which is very strange because, of course, we know candidates run ads, radio and TV ads, months and months before Election Day. They don't wait until early voting starts. But even the people who were pushing Trump's big lie about election fraud in Iowa, even those people were claiming after the election, well, there was fraud in some other states, but our election was fine in Iowa. So then you have to ask, why did they do this? And a lot of people have asked me, well, why would Republicans try to suppress votes in Iowa where they're winning? But if you look at the breakdown of the voter returns, the early voters in Iowa still are a Democratic leaning group. And that was especially true in 2020 with the pandemic, but it was also true in 2016 and 2018. I mean, Hillary Clinton won the early vote in Iowa in 2016, even though she lost the state by 9 points. And Joe Biden and our Senate candidate, Teresa Greenfield, won the early vote in 2020. So I think that even though Republicans are doing well and largely winning elections in Iowa, they still see that they can gain even more of a competitive advantage by just squeezing that early voting period and making it harder and harder for people. We know that those people are Democratic leaning voters to cast an early ballot.
Well, our time with Laura is limited. I want to spin through. There's a lot of great stories here. The next one I mentioned was these charter schools, these vouchers. My quick take on that has always been, Laura, to me, not being a great student, the biggest value of public schools basically was the shared experience, the socialization, the integration, the part that you get to know and trust and see other people, and that we're not run off into our separate camps from the time that we're born, basically, and being raised and educated by our parents or in these specialty charter schools with their own agendas. That's why I've always been opposed to them, but it seems like, this is rearing its ugly head again.
Well, this is an interesting bill that the Iowa House passed last week. So the governor had proposed a big education bill, and part of it was a voucher type system. I think maybe they were called education savings accounts, but basically the concept was vouchers. So you give families money if they take their kids out of public school and go to private school. And interestingly, the families who keep their kids in public school don't get the money, right? It's the cash only goes, so it's an incentive actually to pull your kids out of public school and homeschool. So this ran into some trouble. It passed the Iowa Senate, but in the Iowa House, there were a number of Republicans who didn't want to support this idea of the governor's. And so it stalled. And so now they're trying to pass bits and pieces of that concept as separate legislation. And that's where this charter school bill came from. Right now, under Iowa law, a school district can create its own public charter school. But this bill would say that any group of people basically living in the area could bypass the school district and go straight to the State Department of Education and establish their own charter school. And there would be, very little accountability. And then there would be money. They could get money that would be diverted from the public school system to their new charter school. And it was a huge change. I mean, the bill was amended. A huge amendment was introduced on the House floor. And the Democrats wanted a public hearing on it. And they also wanted an appropriations committee hearing on it because no one has any idea how much this bill would cost. But there was a lot of procedural wrangling on Wednesday night, and the debate went past midnight. But they ended up passing this thing along party lines. And now we'll see what happens to it in the Iowa Senate. But it's all part of the same overall Republican project to take part of the money from public schools and give it to private schools or, who even knows what these charter schools will be doing? They won't be subject to the same standards.
Well, our problem in America isn't that we're not separate enough, certainly. And as your contributor said, I loved it in the article, nothing good happens after midnight. So when they're trying to push this stuff through after midnight, pay attention. Okay, let's go to this next story very quickly then. Redistricting. Now, I've heard something about this. I kind of thought for a while it wasn't going to be that big of an issue. How big a story is this?
Well, Evan Berger he's a great guest contributor, and he's been doing some real deep dives on Iowa redistricting. So Iowa has an excellent redistricting process. It really should be a model for the country. It sets up a nonpartisan committee from the Legislative Services Agency, draws the maps, and normally we would be well into that process. In a normal year after a census, we would already be getting the first proposed nonpartisan maps on April 1st. But everything's been delayed this year because the census was a little bit of a disaster with the pandemic. And so normally the US Census Bureau would be sending states that detailed population data by February of the year ending in 1. And this year, we're probably not even going to get it until September. So it really sets back the process in Iowa. And it means the legislature may not even be able to handle the redistricting because Iowa's constitution sets a deadline for if it's not done by September 15th, the Iowa Supreme Court takes over the process, and no one really knows how that's going to work because the Iowa Supreme Court hasn't explained how they would approach that. But in any case, Evan Berger has looked at the existing law and what we know about population based on 2019 estimates, and he's drawing some interesting conclusions about what the new maps might look like. Of course, we won't know anything about the new maps until probably September at the earliest. But so he took a look at some possible congressional maps for one piece. Another piece looked at Iowa legislative, kind of an overview of how the balance between urban and suburban and rural seats might shift. And then this latest piece that I published on Friday looks specifically at Story County, because Ames is a good example of how very subtle changes in the population count could really affect the Iowa House map.
All right, so let me bring back the page here.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so there she is, Kim Reynolds, and I've got some questions about this on the Facebook page for Podcast by George. People were kind of shocked by this permitless carry thing, and they just couldn't believe that Reynolds would pass this. And I was telling her, that she would not veto it. And I said, I think she's going to pass it. This is the Guns Are Us Republican-controlled legislature. And I said, there's 3 reasons here why she should veto the permitless carry. I looked at it, Laura, and I said, well, there's 3 reasons I can think of she will. And it's number one, first and foremost, her party supports it, and she's a big party crawler in my mind. Her donors support it, obviously. I mean, they're Republican donors, and her voters support it. And I think she's very politically conscious, and that tells me she's going to sign this thing right on time, that it's going to go through quickly. But I don't know. What's your take on it?
And this piece is by Amber Gustafson, who's been a long time volunteer with Moms Demand Gun Action. Look, the governor said at her press conference on Wednesday, well, we're taking a careful look at the bill and we always analyze bills. But let's get real. Okay.
Really?
If a Republican governor doesn't want something on her desk, her staff are going to tell the Republican legislative leaders, don't send me this bill. So I think I can't even imagine a scenario where she would seriously consider vetoing this bill, regardless of what she says in public about it this week. I mean, it's, as you say, it's something the gun lobby wants, Republican voters want, and there's already going to be a state constitutional amendment relating to guns on the ballot in 2022 when she's going to be up for re-election. So I can't imagine that the Governor Reynolds would veto a legislative priority for this faction, and because high turnout among those pro-gun voters is going to be crucial to her own re-election chances.
Exactly.
So I really don't see, what Amber was pointing out is that repeatedly in the past, the governor has said, I support our current system of permits and background checks. And also, Amber mentioned a part of the bill, the attention has been on the fact that permits for concealed carry would no longer be mandatory. But there are other really concerning parts of this bill, and one of them would allow firearms to be carried on school grounds by certain people, or in vehicles in the car line at school, or parent-teacher conferences. I mean, I just don't know. Do we want people carrying to the high school gym, to the basketball game? Do we want people? I mean, there are a lot of questions about that, and this is something the gun lobby has wanted for years. But for many years, it never even got past a committee. Even in the Republican-controlled Iowa House, they would keep this thing bottled up in committee. So it just shows how much more extreme the Republican legislature is now, that this bill passed the Iowa House and Senate without one dissenting vote in the GOP caucus. And again, this is something that was considered 5-10 years ago even to be a really radical idea, even in Republican circles.
Well, that tells you something, and that's it's the hierarchy, it's the priority that really shocked me because it seems like we're picking on Republicans here, but folks, I tell people this all the time. Yeah, I'm a lefty, so I'm living in that world. But Laura's an investigative journalist. She's a member of the Fourth Estate. She's supposed to be an adversary for these branches of government that are in power. We've got a Republican-controlled legislature and a Republican governor, so she's hard on these people, and she ought to be. And I look at this, Laura, and again, the Republicans take complete control of the state, basically, all three branches of government. And what's the number one priority? What's the thing that they sit down and put at the top of the list for this session? We need more and better access to guns. I mean,
Right.
Are you kidding me? I mean, that's unbelievable in the state that we live in the world that we live in, that's priority number one.
And I should say, when Bleeding Heartland was started in 2007, the Democrats controlled the legislature and the governor's office, and I was tough on them. I mean, I wrote a lot of critical posts. So, I look forward to the day if we do have a Democratic governor. I'll be a watchdog on that, on any state officials who are abusing their power or doing things that aren't in the public interest.
Well, you know that she is because they're trying to keep her out of reporting on the legislature. Laura's not allowed in the governor's news conferences. I mean, they're aware of it, and she's fulfilling that role as an adversary, as a member of the Fourth Estate. And one of the things that Laura's been doing is following the money with the CARES money that came down from the federal government, moved into the governor's office, and what she's been doing with it. And we've got another story, another revelation on that.
Yes, I published this story last week. So the CARES Act, if you look online, there are a lot of public databases on how Iowa spent the CARES Act money. And you can find thousands of entries on specific CARES Act expenditures, but there's a lot they don't tell you. So tens of millions of dollars have been routed through Iowa's Office of Chief Information Officer. And about $50 million of that went toward broadband grants for local telephone agencies. And that's reasonable, right? With more people working from home, with more people studying from home, of course, we need to expand broadband. But about $25 million that went to the Office of Chief Information Officer was just under sort of general technology upgrades. And so I started looking on these databases at the spending, and I found that many of these expenditures were just labeled, the purpose was just labeled either IT, outside services, or IT equipment and software. And it didn't tell you anything about what kind of equipment or who it was for. And so I do a lot of work with Iowa's open records law. And in December, I submitted a really detailed, this was very time consuming because it was kind of a shot in the dark, asking about like 75 different purchases and documents related to all these different purchases for the Office of Chief Information Officer. When I finally got the records in late February, I saw that one of the expenditures was for the Office of Chief Information Officer did the spending, but the beneficiary was the governor's office, and it was to move their computers from Google and Gmail to Microsoft Office 365. And, the CARES Act is supposed to be for necessary expenditures and
pandemic money, yeah.
Emergency. So, moving from Gmail to Outlook Mail, I mean, it might be desirable if you're running an office, but I can't really see how it's related to the public health emergency. But what was even more interesting was that I had asked about this expenditure because it showed up on the database as, it's about $39,000 spent in late November. And I submitted this records request on December 9th. And then I realized in some of the records that I saw that the governor's office reimbursed the Office of Chief Information Officer for this expense on December 16th. And so it really made me wonder, why did they just pay the money back because they knew that I was asking about this spending? And the governor's press secretary, he didn't answer any of my questions before I published. I emailed him several times over a period of 10 days or 2 weeks. And he didn't answer any of the questions, but 20 minutes after I published, he said, "This isn't true. We didn't ultimately spend the money. We didn't spend CARES Act money." I said, "Well, you spent CARES Act money on it in November and then reimbursed for it in December." And he said, "Well, CARES Act money ultimately wasn't used." And I said, "Well, who approved?" So again, I asked some of my questions. Who approved the idea of spending CARES Act money to move from Gmail to Office 65? And who decided in December to pay the money back? And no response. So I wasn't surprised.
You know, you and I have talked about this before because when I hear these stories, and people on my podcast have heard me mention this all the time, this correlation that I cite from the movie Casino with Robert De Niro talking about his slot manager that gets taken advantage of on 3 jackpots in a row, and it's like, and he looks at him and says, "You're either too dumb or you're in on it." And I look at these politicians, and you describe this to me, and that's what I think. They're either too dumb or they're in on it. And I'm not sure where to come down on these things sometimes. But the other thing I think, Laura, that maybe a further extension of that is this the new normal? I talked about the fact that the Republicans are now in power. If we ever change things in this state, and I don't know if and when that's ever going to happen, but is this the way that politics is going to be done now? Are you going to have politicians that just use the open records law when it's to their benefit, that preclude reporters like yourself from reporting? And is this the way that it's going to be from now on? Has the world changed, or is this something that can be changed with an election?
Well, I think, unfortunately, we've seen at the federal level as well as in Iowa that legislators are not interested in oversight of an executive that was a member of their party. So, I mean, we have the Iowa House and Senate have government oversight committees. And I've reported on, and other people have reported on, questionable CARES Act spending. And these oversight committees are not holding any hearings or doing any investigation of what the governor is doing with this money, because she's a Republican. And you can be sure that if we had a Democratic governor doing any of this, they would be all over that. I mean, instead, we have the Iowa House Government Oversight Committee had an hour and 45-minute long hearing grilling Ames school district officials about their Black Lives Matter curriculum. I mean, it's just, like, why they're just punching down instead of doing the oversight that they're supposed to do. And we saw that again during the Trump administration, where the Senate just wasn't interested in any oversight of the scandals going on. And those included violations of, not responding to congressional subpoenas, which was something that, that would have been an article of impeachment against Richard Nixon, that he didn't fulfill a congressional subpoena. Well, Trump ignored many of those. And the fact that the governor hasn't, her office just stopped complying with the open records law. I mean, I'm fortunate that I can still get records from other state agencies. In this case, it was from the Office of Chief Information Officer. But a lot of what I've reported on in the last 6 months related to the CARES Act spending for the governor's staff salaries, related to the strike team, using the Iowa National Guard and other resources to conduct COVID-19 testing at a company that was linked to major donor Bruce Rastetter. I mean, I've requested records from the governor's office, and I'm sure that there are emails and other records that would shed light on some of those decisions. And I just haven't been able to get any of those records from the governor's office. So I've been able to do some reporting based on records I've received from other agencies. But I mean, this, Iowa Code Chapter 22, which is our open records law, I mean, it's a law. It doesn't have an exception in there for when there's a pandemic. So it's a frustration to me. But I just want to emphasize that this open records work can be a really long slog. And sometimes you spend a lot of time and you don't receive anything newsworthy, and then sometimes you find a nugget like this thing about, and I'm still investigating some of the other spending by the Office of Chief Information Officer, but you just don't really know. You've got to put in a lot of hours and you don't know whether you'll get something at the end. And then sometimes when my follow-up questions on these records aren't answered.
Well, and it's a lot of work. It's a lot of time, and then you have people that we obfuscate when you contact them. So this is the kind of abuse that Laura is putting out there. And I love that analogy that you use. I've used it on the podcast before. And folks, if this stuff doesn't interest you, if you don't understand it, I don't know. Sometimes I understand it. Sometimes I can't believe it. But the thing that she said there that was really key is punching down. The problems that we have in this country will never be solved punching down on people that have no power, that have no money. Hell, some of them can't even vote. The solution to our problems is to punch up. And that's what Bleeding Heartland and Laura Belin is doing. And we're out of time. Time just flies when I get Laura on the show. Laura, I want to give you a last word here. Wrap it up for us. Give us a close, and we'll take it out for this episode.
Well, for people who want to get material by email, I do have a new email newsletter. It's free. It's got the same, all the content is still available on the website, bleedingheartland.com. But if you'd like to receive 2 or 3 times a week an email with a compilation of headlines from the site, you can sign up at www.bleedingheartland.com/evening. And we won't share your email addresses, or we're not going to try to sell you anything. This is just for the people who prefer. Some people like getting emails. A lot of people don't, but I've heard over the years from readers that they'd like to have this option. So there it is.
Yeah, I love it because I even don't get to visit the site as often as I should. And here comes that email, and it's a quick synopsis. And just think of the stories that we ran through on the top of the blog on this show, folks. That's the kind of stuff that you get from Bleeding Heartland. I'm going to put the URLs up, the web addresses, and we'll have those on the website. And we'll get back with her when we can because she's very busy, obviously. Laura, thanks again for coming on a podcast by George.
Thanks, George. I always appreciate the opportunity.
Folks, that's going to do it. That's this edition of Podcast by George. If you like us, we're easily found. You can find us at podcastbygeorge.com. You can pick the platform that you want to follow us on there. We're on Facebook, easy there. Just query Podcast by George. You'll come up with it. It's a unique name. And then on YouTube, of course, would like everybody to subscribe there. We're building that audience. We're starting to get some views, hundreds, thousands, sometimes of views on YouTube for our episodes. So that's very good. Just subscribe and ring the notification bell so that you get notice of each and every episode. But that's going to wrap it up. That's going to do it. That's all there is for this show. There ain't no more. That's another podcast by George.